começar. Prontinho. Sejam bem-vindos e bem-vindas ao evento de lançamento da Rede Meros do Brasil do Atlântico. Esse evento é a Conservation Network na conferência do site evento oficial da Conferência Nacional do ano 2022. Para quem está assistindo a gente, vocês podem escolher no ícone... Um minutinho. No ícone interpretação, no botão interpretação, você pode escolher a língua que você está falando. No ícone interpretação, você pode escolher o inglês ou português. Esse evento reunirá pessoas e instituições para pensar em soluções de conservação do Meros, preencher lacunas de conhecimento e expandir e fortalecer esforços de proteção à espécie em todo o Atlântico. Uma das principais contribuições desse evento paralelo reside em promover pela primeira vez a colaborar de várias instituições internacionais na procura de futuro próximo para a conservação de ambientes marinhos e costeiros através de uma espécie de peixe tido como símbolo da bandeira. Convidamos agora para dar as boas-vindas Jonas Rodrigues Leite, biólogo e doutor em oceanografia ambiental, presidente do Instituto Meros do Brasil e gerente executivo do projeto Meros do Brasil, e Átila Bertontini, diretor em ecologia e trabalha com conservação de peixes e ambientes marinhos. Atualmente é coordenador de pesquisa e projeto Meros. Sejam bem-vindos.
Bom dia, Elise. Muito obrigado. Bom dia, Átila. É uma honra estar aqui hoje nesse evento de apresentação da Rede Meros do Atlântico. Eu, Jonas Rodrigues Leite, hoje estou como presidente do Instituto Meros do Brasil e gostaria de dar as boas-vindas a todos os convidados que estão presentes hoje aqui, que representam o Brasil, o México, o Panamá, Estados Unidos e toda a audiência de vários lugares do mundo. Elise, você pode transmitir o slide, por favor, na minha apresentação? Ótimo. Pode passar o próximo slide, por favor? Eu vou começar apresentando a linha do tempo do Instituto Meros do Brasil, com alguns marcos importantes da história do Instituto e que culminam nesse momento que a gente está aqui hoje. Em 2002, Não, pode voltar o slide, por favor, continuar no primeiro. Em 2002... Não. No segundo slide, por favor, Elise. Em 2002, a gente teve no Brasil a criação do Projeto Meros do Brasil, através de pescadores que procuraram pesquisadores da universidade preocupados com as populações de mero, do Epinephelus e itajara, na costa de Santa Catarina. Com isso, pesquisadores do Brasil, que fundaram depois o Instituto Meros, iniciaram o Projeto Meros do Brasil lá em 2002. Nesse mesmo ano, já com o apoio do projeto, a espécie Epinephelus itajara, o mero. Pode voltar um slide ainda, Elise. teve uma legislação específica, então, sendo a primeira espécie marinha de peixe brasileira a ter uma legislação específica de proibição de pesca visando sua conservação. Avançando até 2006, com todo o trabalho do Projeto Meros do Brasil ao longo do Brasil, um país gigante, né, de escala continental, a gente foi criada a Rede Meros do Brasil, né, já que o Projeto Meros do Brasil trabalha com diversas parcerias ao longo de todo o país. Em 2007, esse projeto do Brasil foi convidado para participar do 60º encontro do Instituto de Pesca do Golfo do Caribe, né, o DCFI, e foi um marco muito importante, tanto para o Projeto Meros do Brasil, e que trouxe essa experiência na fundação do Instituto Meros do Brasil. Então, em 2013, os participantes do Projeto Meros do Brasil entenderam que era o momento de institucionalizar tudo que a gente vinha fazendo, e foi fundado o Instituto Meros do Brasil. Próximo slide, por favor. Isso. Então, o Instituto Meros do Brasil tem como missão hoje promover o uso sustentável e a conservação de ambientes marinhos e costeiros, espécies ameaçadas, implantação e manejo de áreas marinhas protegidas por meio da produção, divulgação e implementação de conhecimento técnico-científico. Próximo, por favor. Como eu falei antes, o Instituto Meros do Brasil trabalha de forma em parcerias e rede, então, com a Rede Meros do Brasil. Então, o Instituto conta com uma rede importante de mais de 60 parceiros, que envolve organizações governamentais, organizações da sociedade civil, agências de fomento, universidades, institutos de pesquisa, movimentos sociais e culturais, não só do Brasil, mas de todo o mundo. Próximo slide, por favor. E aí, por que agora, né? Por que agora essa ideia de criar essa rede de conservação de meros do Atlântico? Atualmente, nós, do Instituto Meros do Brasil, a gente está num momento muito importante com o Projeto Meros do Brasil, né? A dimensão e a importância que o Projeto Meros do Brasil tem hoje no Brasil e para a espécie, com a Rede Meros do Brasil, maior do que nunca e super funcional, e para a própria espécie, né? No momento, os Epinephelus e itajara hoje têm tido seus status atualizados constantemente, e suas leis nos países, não só no Brasil, mas nos países em que existem leis de proteção, elas têm sido revisadas também nesse momento. E ao longo de 20 anos da existência do Projeto Meros, né, a institucionalização do projeto com o Instituto, o patrocínio da Petrobras, através do programa socioambiental, culminam nesse momento que a gente chegou hoje. Próximo, por favor. E aí a gente não está começando essa ideia do zero, né? O desejo e a necessidade por essa rede vem de 2007, quando no evento, como eu falei na linha do tempo anteriormente, então no DCFI teve o primeiro simpósio internacional dos Meros, né, onde nós fomos convidados, e diversos dos palestrantes que estão aqui hoje estavam lá presentes também, e são atuantes no DCFI. Então, a gente traz isso como um marco, né, não só para essa ideia, mas para o dia de hoje, como a gente está lançando aqui essa pedra fundamental, essa pedra inicial dessa rede tão importante para a espécie. Próximo, por favor. Então, temos evento virtual internacional planejado para o ano que vem, para a efetivação dessa rede de conservação de meros do Atlântico. Com isso, a gente achou muito importante, nessa semana e nesse espaço da ONU, né, impulsionarmos a criação dessa rede e seguindo, inclusive, os Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável, especificamente o 14, proteger a vida marinha, e o 17, parcerias para a implementação dos objetivos. O Instituto Meros do Brasil acredita que é o momento certo de fazer as coisas. Próximo, por favor. Então, é uma honra receber aqui todos os convidados numa semana tão importante para o oceano e para o mundo, né, oficializando o desenvolvimento dessa rede de conservação. Próximo. Obrigado. Convido agora, passo a palavra para o Dr. Átila, que vai apresentar um pouco da Rede Meros do Brasil.
Obrigada, Jonas. Obrigada. Átila, eu posso só dar algumas orientações antes para a gente começar o nosso evento?
Oh, for sure. For sure. It's with you. I would just remind them about taking a look for the one that just arrived, to take a look at the chat, all right? And they can be aware that we have channels for 2 languages, and just remind the speakers that they have 10 minutes talk, all right? And you can go on, Elise, then I present the first speaker.
Muito obrigada, Átila. Vou passar só algumas informações importantes para a gente ter o nosso evento ter muito sucesso. Esse primeiro, só para vocês visualizarem aqui, que é o que o Átila acabou de falar, a gente tem um botão interpretação e vocês podem escolher a língua que vocês gostariam de escutar o seminário, ou em inglês ou em português. Se quiserem, também pode mutar o áudio original, porque o áudio original você fica ouvindo baixinho. Se você quiser ouvir só na língua, a gente tem toda a equipe de tradução aqui para orientar vocês. O objetivo desse evento é o lançamento da Rede de Conservação Meros do Atlântico na Conferência do Oceano em 2022. A gente está muito feliz com esse lançamento. E para a gente poder, realmente, vocês que estão aí na audiência, a gente está vendo aqui, já tem 47 participantes, a gente está muito feliz de poder vocês participarem. A gente vai colocar um link agora do Mentimeter para vocês no chat. Então, durante as apresentações, vocês podem contribuir. A gente tem 2 perguntas para vocês. Como vocês têm contribuído? Vou mostrar aqui para vocês. Como vocês têm contribuído com a conservação marinha no contexto da realidade onde vive, e também em uma palavra, como você deseja que a década, que o oceano esteja após essa década. Então, a gente realmente gostaria muito que vocês participassem dessa interação, porque com essa interação a gente vai conseguir, depois, ao final do evento, sentir aí essa energia que vocês estão assistindo o nosso evento. Outro ponto importante, gente, a gente vai ter um momento ao final, depois de todas as palestras, a gente vai ter um momento de perguntas e respostas, e para isso vocês vão usar esse botão Q&A, Q&A, né? Esse botão de question and answer, né? Tá em inglês, esse botão de perguntas, é onde vocês vão colocar. A gente solicita também que vocês coloquem o nome do palestrante antes da pergunta, para que a gente possa identificar e, ao final, a gente trazer essas perguntas para serem respondidas. A gente também vai mandar outro link agora para vocês, muito importante para a gente que vocês registrem sua presença. A presença é somente o nome e e-mail, é bem rapidinho que vocês fazem esse registro, e a gente precisa disso para poder depois fazer comunicação com vocês via e-mail. Então, para a gente é muito importante que vocês façam registro da presença de vocês. Então, muito obrigada pela presença. Eu vou passar a palavra agora para o Átila fazer as honras e começar a brilhantar o nosso evento.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Hope you are all well. I would like to welcome you all to our talk today, and we are going to start with a very special speaker. I would like to invite Dr. Felicia Coleman. She's an ecologist who has worked on US groupers for the past 30 years and has a strong interest in the intersection of science and policy. She retired from the Florida State University in 2020 as a faculty member and director of the Florida State University Coastal and Marine Lab. She now is focused and committed on a reassessment of the global status of the Atlantic Goliath grouper for the IUCN Groupers and Rosses Specialists Group with Chris Malski and Attila Bertoncini, me. Okay, so Dr. Felicia, please.
Yeah, let me make sure I am sharing my screen. Can you see it?
Perfectly.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Attila, for that introduction. And I have to say that the opportunity to be speaking at the UN conference on the ocean couldn't have come at a better time. And I say this because the IUCN has just launched a study to look at the global status, reassessing the global status of Goliath grouper, of the Atlantic Goliath grouper. And I view this really as a call to arms because the call of arms is from the IUCN to the scientific community engaged in research on this iconic and utterly fascinating species, as we all know, who've been working on it for so long. Let's hope this advances. And it does not seem to want to advance. Okay. The entity that's taking on this project is the Grouper and Wrasses Specialist Group at the IUCN. And the mission of that group is to promote the conservation, management, and the wise use of fishes in the families Epinephelus, the groupers, and the labrids, the wrasses. And what we want to do is enhance the vulnerability, awareness of the vulnerability of not only the fish species, but the habitats within which they live. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The purpose is to call attention to these species and protect them. And the group is made up of about 40 people from 20 different countries. But the specific project of interest is reassessing the global status. And these three crazy people down here at the bottom are the people who are in charge of carrying this out. That's me, Malinowski, and Chris Malinowski, and Attila. The 2018 assessment for Goliath grouper was led by Attila, and it basically shifted the status of Goliath grouper from critically endangered to vulnerable. But the point needs to be made that resulted not from any real change in the population status, but in a change in the stricter applications of IUCN Red List assessment criteria. And also by being able to analyze the data more effectively. I want to note also that while the U.S. fishery for Goliath grouper closed in 1990, and there were some signs of recovery for the next few decades, there were a number of things that led to a reversal of that fortune. Basically, one was the increase in a catch and release fishery with high mortality rates, particularly for adults, and two other things, one for which management had no control, and the other which was completely caused by mismanagement by policymakers as well as by natural resource agencies. Now let's start with the thing that they had no control over, the weather. In 2010, South Florida had a cold water event that had a massive kill of Goliath grouper. And these are fishes that can't withstand temperatures over about 15 degrees centigrade. Actual temperatures during that event not only were much colder, between 3 and 5 degrees centigrade, but they lasted much longer. It's one thing to be exposed to cold weather for a day or two. It's quite another to be exposed to it for 2 weeks. Mortality was at least 90% for the juveniles in the mangroves. These are fish ages 0 to 6 years old. It's before they move offshore to join adult populations, but it also killed many adults. There's been no real sign of recruitment to adult populations since then. And so this has been a really terrible type of event with consequences that management does not take into account at all. The other thing that's happened here on a quite regular basis on the West Florida coast is red tide, which is caused by the dinoflagellate Carenia brevis. It's amplified by eutrophication in coastal waters. And in this case, it was a tremendous leakage from a defunct phosphate plant into Tampa Bay that caused it. This is not the first time that such a leakage has happened. There were red tide events in 05, 08, 10, 18, and 2021. And these things have gone from being small and persisting for a few days to lasting for several months. In the 2021 event, there was clearly about over 2,000 tons of marine organisms cleared up from the beaches, including Goliath grouper. And one of the things that was different about this event is that there was no effort made to determine Goliath grouper mortality, where before there were people out there actually making counts, at least from the beach. Now, these deaths for these marine organisms don't include the nearshore area where if anything didn't show up on the beach, it wasn't counted as a kill. So the call to arms. We need your help. We need to know if there have been similar types of setbacks elsewhere within the range of Goliath grouper. We need to know who we should be talking to about these sorts of events. So please provide us with that information, or let us know about scientists who are working and have access to information that could be helpful. There, as you can see, there are an enormous number of areas of interest for Goliath grouper. And you can find this list in the 2018, not the 2019 N assessment. But please, anything you can do to help, you can send the information to me at fcoleman@fsu.edu or to Atchler or Chris, whoever you want. But we really need your help. So thanks very much for the opportunity to speak. And I hope I'll be hearing from you soon. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much, Felicia, for your talk. Very interesting, very important, this reassessment of the Goliath grouper status. Okay, so I'm going to call the next speaker, and then we'll have a talk at the end of all the speakers, okay? So let me call Dr. Rachel Grantham. She is a marine conservation scientist with a PhD in environmental and economics. Dr. Rachel, she has 24 years of scientific and conservation experience with marine megafauna in several ocean basins, including Goliath groupers. Rachel is the founder ED of the International...
Atila, a Rachel está com uma dificuldade com a internet. A gente pode passar para o Chris e depois a gente volta para a Rachel?
Can be. Yeah. All right. Okay, so just let me find Mr. Malinowski. Okay, so I would like to invite Chris Malinowski. Okay, he's a doctor in ecology based in the USA who has worked with groupers and other fishes for over a decade with a strong focus on conservation-related research. He is the Director of Research and Conservation for Ocean First Institute and is currently working on numerous research projects related to fish, sharks, and the impacts of various pollutants on fishes along the southern coast of Florida. He is also working with Felicia and Attila on a reassessment of the global status of the Atlantic Goliath grouper for the IUCN. So, Mr. Chris, I'd like to invite you for your talk. Welcome.
Thank you. How does that look? You see my talk?
Just great.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This is such a wonderful opportunity to get together with all of you experts from around the world. that are all interested in the conservation of this species and many others. It's a very important topic, and as others have said, this is a model species that really does indicate a lot of management efforts and conservation efforts regionally in Florida and also globally, so that it's really good to be here for this sort of an effort. So to give you a little bit of background on what has gone on in the United States with the management of the species and population status, the Goliath grouper population of the Southeast United States declined to near extinction levels in the 1980s. But because of that, there were efforts to protect the species fully, both federally and in state waters from fishing. So no harvest was allowed after 1990. And you can see on the right graphic showing basically population trends. The top figure shows juvenile indices, so those are more near shore in that life stage, and then below is adult indices. And I'll mention this later as well. These indices are based on recreational surveys and citizen science data. There has not been a great effort to standardize the approach for various reasons, partly because of their protection, to standardize the way in which population levels are monitored. So that is one need that the state and federal government has been missing in the United States. And because of this protection, though, you can see these population trends, and you can see the rise in declines and the recovery. So recovery began at that point in 1990, but it was reversed in the mid to late 2000s by what Dr. Coleman had mentioned, by red tide and extreme cold snap events in South Florida. And so you can see that drop off where you see the lines go up and then they come down very rapidly where there's cold events that occurred. And so you basically lost at least 6 years of recruitment into the adult population, and you see a similar effect happening in the adult population where there was a loss of recruitment, so population levels went down. And so one of the important factors is that Goliath grouper production depends on healthy mangroves and good water quality. And though there's a lot of restoration efforts that have been ongoing in the state of Florida, specifically South Florida, the estuaries are still in very poor condition. Habitat is, especially red mangrove habitat, has largely been lost in the state. And it's a small fraction of what it once was. So recruitment of juveniles to the adult population is still severely limited. And you can see this here. This is a better graphic of what's happening with the adult population that was not represented in that previous figure, which was developed by the state. Here, this was provided by Dr. Dan Greenberg at Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And this is analyzing citizen science dive survey data, which is fairly representative of what is happening in the adult Goliath grouper population. So on the left, you can see a figure specifically from Florida Keys that shows this trend very well, the population rebuilding from the time of their protection in the early 90s, and then a drop off around 2010 into recent times. And then collectively, all of the data in the right graphic showing all regions, you see a similar trend. And Dr. Greenberg estimated from these data that following the recovery in the 1990s up until about 2010, the average count then declined by about over 53% into 2020. So that's really difficult to understand because they've been protected, other than to bring in the idea that, red tide events, cold water events, we know that has had large mortality events, even with the protection. So even with the protection, they're losing a lot of their population. In addition to that, high mercury concentrations, research that myself and colleagues, Dr. Coleman and Drs. Koenig and others have done, have shown that they are very high, higher than any other grouper in the Western Atlantic. And compared to other species that are on the do not eat list in the United States. And here, this is from a previous publication, shows that there's no advisory, but as I'll, because they have been protected, but as I'll bring up in the next slide or two, that has now been reversed and they will be allowed to be harvested to a limited extent. And so they do come into play here with the avoid category because they're higher than all the other species like tilefish, swordfish, and sharks that are on the avoid list, even though they're legal to catch and harvest to some extent. and beyond the muscle tissue having high mercury concentrations, also their eggs and their sperm have extraordinarily high mercury concentrations as well. So not only is the mercury impacting the health of the fish itself, it also has impacts on the reproductive potential. And then lastly, the value of Goliath grouper, as you all know, is highest when they are alive more than when they are dead, especially with the dive ecotourism industry. I share a graphic on the right here, just showing some information that was shared from a prominent dive shop in South Florida, showing that after they started marketing Goliath grouper as a major attraction for divers, especially during their spawning aggregations, when they come in numbers up to around 100 individuals on a single reef, which is incredible to observe, their revenue and number of divers that came to visit their dive shops, specifically during the time when they could observe Goliath grouper, has continued to increase. So we know that there's a huge economic boon that has been created by marketing the species as a dive attraction, much more so than a fishery could produce. But what has happened, this is the news from Florida in March of 2022, is that the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, these are the managers of state waters, they have approved a lethal harvest that is limited to recreational fishermen in Florida. That is to begin in the spring of 2023, and will allow for 200 fish in the juvenile age class range to be harvested. And we have strongly, along with many of you in the scientific community, Doctors Felicia Coleman, Chris Koenig, and myself wrote this letter to the commissioners and very clearly stated the best available science that indicated, and we strongly recommend that the harvest was not open to fishing, and that the recovery was allowed to continue. And we made 4 major points in this. Number one, that the public perception that Goliath grouper are invasive and destroying habitat is flawed. So there's a lot of misperception of the species, and so largely there's been a failure of educating the public on the beneficial nature of the species. They're actually ecosystem engineers, so they increase diversity of fishes on the reefs, not the opposite. So that is largely flawed perception by the public. Second, as I mentioned, is that there are high mercury concentrations in the fish that have severe consequences to the fish themselves and also to humans that consume them. And likewise, there's a recruitment to adult populations that is limited. Partly that is due to the high concentration of mercury that is in their eggs and in the sperm of the fish, so it impacts reproduction. But also, as I mentioned, juvenile habitat water quality remains poor and limited. And so you get a loss of juvenile recruitment into the adult population. And then lastly, there has not been an actual viable alternative economic consideration that has not been addressed, namely with the dive ecotourism industry, showing that the benefit of keeping this fish alive and not allowing them to be harvested is far outweighs the killing of this fish. So lastly, I listed some of the research needs that I think are necessary to fill in data gaps in the United States and elsewhere. And number one that Dr. Coleman had mentioned is to reassess their population status globally and also regionally, now that we have more data that we've collected, and because there's been a drop off in their population and more red tide and cold water, or more red tide events that we know has resulted in mortality events since the last status update. As I mentioned earlier, there's not a standardized monitoring of juvenile and adult populations that is measured beyond recreational and citizen science data. So that is something that really needs to be done. And this is especially to evaluate any impact of the harvest. I'll state here that our state management that has allowed for this harvest to be open, they have not proposed any way to evaluate the impact of this harvest. And so this is something that we should all work on together, and it's something that I'm very interested in trying to implement, is to some way of better evaluating the population status, especially before this opens up to the harvest in the spring of next year. There's also a lack of understanding still of their genetic mixing between the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic populations. that needs to be better resolved. There's still limited information on their movement, especially between the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic, but we still know very little about where these fish go and come from between spawning aggregation parts of the year and their residential times of the year. And then, also understanding better how juveniles recruit into adult populations, more movement data on that would be very beneficial. Other than mercury, there hasn't been much known about other additional pollutants, and we know there are quite a few more. There's studies ongoing right now about pharmaceuticals impacting fish around the coast of Florida. So other pollutants that we should really be considering, the impacts beyond mercury of the species, the effects on the species from poor water quality and habitat loss and limited habitat. There's not been an assessment, even though there's one ongoing right now, about the catch and release impact on spawning. There's a large catch and release fishery for the species right now, but we do not know how that impacts their spawning and their reproduction. And then lastly, there needs to be an economic impact assessment. That this has not been done to show the benefit of the species being kept alive and continuing to recover. So with that, I will end my presentation and look forward to some feedback and discussion following these topics.
Okay, Chris. Thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you.
Very interesting data and great.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. So to continue, is Alfonso ready? Or should we call Rachel?
Não, Átila, a Rachel está com dificuldade de entrar. Continua.
Okay. So, let's keep up with Alfonso. So now I'd like to invite Dr. Alfonso Aguilar Pereira, a biologist with a master's and PhD in biological oceanography, with a tenure position at the University Autónoma de Yucatán in Mérida, Yucatán, Mexico. He has been working for more than 2 decades with biological and conservation aspects of groupers and snappers from the southern Gulf of Mexico and Mérida and Mexican Caribbean. And he's also a member of the specialist group of groupers and rosses and the snappers sea bream and grunts from the IUCN. So Alfonso, thank you very much for coming, and it will be great to hear you.
Thank you. Thank you, Attila. Thank you for everybody to be here. I'm really honored to be here and have the opportunity to present an overview of the situation of this grouper here in Mexico. That I'm going to begin with a sad story, and then I think it's going to change to a happy story about this fish. First of all, I was told that this talk is, the audience of this talk is general. I mean, it's for the public. So I'm going to present the overview based on that regard, try to present an overview of the situation. I'm going to be very brief because the knowledge or the scientific procedures or any of the management is very few for this particular species here in Mexico. So the Goliath grouper here in Mexico is called cherna. Cherna is the common name for this grouper. And when you talk to fishers and you talk to spear divers, the name is cherna. They don't know this grouper has Goliath, and we need to use the name cherna just to do an introspection, trying to do our research with the people. So I'm going to begin saying that in Mexico we have 2 populations, and this is 2 species, and one is the Atlantic Goliath grouper, the Epinephelus itajara, and the other one is the Pacific Goliath grouper, the Epinephelus quinquefasciatus, that this later grouper was described or named recently, 10 years ago. And both populations in Mexico are in very, very poor situation. We really don't know what's going on in terms of fisheries or in terms of basic biology. That's the part of the sad story. And I'm gonna call this grouper the forgotten grouper in Mexico. We have 17 species of groupers. 10 of them have commercial importance. The star of the movie is the red grouper in the Gulf, is the Epinephelus morio, because of the high importance for export importance. But this grouper is very, very, very distant compared to the economic importance of red grouper. So that's why I call it the forgotten grouper, because also the federal authority here in Mexico doesn't have any regulation, and that's a sad story. There is no regulation, everybody can catch this Goliath, and we can't know for sure what's going on. So we need to struggle to try to find what's going on with the fishers, try to record statistics is really, really difficult. So I'm going to talk more on the Atlantic Goliath. The Atlantic Goliath grouper, or Cherna, is more common in the southern Gulf of Mexico and the Mexican Caribbean. However, there is a difference in terms of the waters, because the waters in the southern Gulf of Mexico are turbid and in the Mexican Caribbean are clear. And that's the basic difference where the fishers are trying to find the grouper, because this grouper is catch with spear guns, explosive points of spear guns. So I'm going to present now the main key points based on the questions. You can see how's the Goliath grouper doing in the region. So as I said, molecular studies have revealed that there are two species or two populations, but both of them are really in need to understand what's going on with the populations. Most of the work I've been doing in the last years have based on the socio-ecological approach, because I get fishers interviews with veteran fishers and try to recreate what's going on based on what they say and based on basic statistics they have. The declining population trends in the southern Gulf of Mexico is a reality. The populations are going down, down, down based on the records. However, there's still small populations remain. That's the good news. They say that it's rare, but at least it's there. For decades, the speargun has been the fishing gear, the most important fishing gear used to extract this grouper. And even the situation in the Pacific is worse, because the population situation there is unknown. So there is no studies in reproduction, but indirect evidence based on fishers' interviews. They say that they have seen this grouper spawn, not actually spawning, but having the gonads mature from May to July. So it is required to identify the spawning sites. Some fishers I've interviewed say that they witnessed spawning aggregations, but they didn't reveal where. I don't know why. So there are some opinions about what's going on with this grouper. Some say that it is good to catch this grouper because it's like a relief for the fishers' families. But others say that it's a crime to catch this grouper because it's really huge. And sometimes some fishers say, and some people say that the meat, the flavor of the meat of this such giant is different to the to the other species of groupers. I mean, they don't prefer this particular fish, but it has a value in the market. So there is a conflict of interest in for the people who, because there is not a dependence of this fishery here in Mexico, because the other grouper, the red grouper, is the most important. This one is like a incidental catch. So the Mexican Fishery Authority is the CONAPESCA, has no management regulation at all. They only established a fishing ban, and the fishing ban is directed to the red grouper that has a completely different reproductive season. So that's the ban doesn't cover the reproductive season of Goliath. In 2014, the CONAPESCA established a management plan, but this management plan was most focused on red grouper. However, they suggested a permanent ban for Goliath, but they say, I mean, the authorities said that more information is needed. So can you imagine 2014, now we are 2022, and nothing has been done. And even in the Pacific, nothing has been done in the Pacific. We don't know what's going on with the Goliath there. The Goliath doesn't represent the target fishery in the region. Probably that's the reason why the federal government is not interested. So what are the main challenges for this? Is that the federal authority must recognize the Goliath population need for protection. Scientific research is required to know how many Goliaths remain. What are the juveniles or the babies which are the areas where the babies are? And finding ways for conservation. Fishers should support and avoid catching more Goliaths. So, it's important to protect the broodstock at spawning sites and juveniles at the mangroves. The problem with the fishes in the ocean is who protects the broodstock? The broodstock in the farmed animals, for instance, is really protected because the broodstock is important, but in the ocean, who's protecting the broodstock? Talks are needed to the public for engaging them in conservation. Very few people try to talk to people to say, hey, this is what's going on. So it's important to create a local network for stakeholders to promote trust for the protection of Goliath. So what's important for this network? Lessons learned from Brazil are relevant. You in Brazil are doing a fantastic job engaging people, engaging stakeholders. So it's important to build an alliance, stakeholders, academia, and government to support the Goliath. Shared expertise between network members would be vital. I mean, this procedure we're doing now, trying to exchange what you have, what I don't have, what we need, is important. Financial opportunities are very important. If you don't have money, you can't do anything in order to try to convey what you really want. Create popular materials, either printed or digital, for effective communication in different languages will be key in order to promote the conservation of Goliath, not only here in Mexico, but in the region. So if we keep the information as scientists, this will be very difficult, and we need to go a step beyond. So I did it in 10 minutes. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, Alfonso, 10 minutes sharp. Wow.
10 minutes sharp.
That's great. Yeah. Thank you very much for your talk. And now, just to make a continue, we're going to call Dr. Rachel. Okay, Rachel, she's in transit and she wisely recorded her presentation. So I'm going to present her, and then after we're going to watch her video of her presentation, okay? So Dr. Rachel is a marine conservation scientist with a PhD in environmental and economics. She has 24 years of scientific and conservation experience with marine megafauna and several other basins, including the Goliath grouper. Rachel is the founder, CEO of the International Mar Alliance, and she is a visiting lecturer with the University of Exeter, a Peale Marine Fellow, and serves on the IUCN Shark Specialist Group and the World Commission of Protected Areas. Okay, so Elise, I think we can play her presentation, right? Just great.
Hello, good morning. This is Rachel Grantham. I am the founder and executive director of Mar Alliance, an international NGO that focuses on the recovery of large threatened marine wildlife, notably Goliath grouper, sharks, rays, sea turtles, and other. And today I'll be talking about some of the Goliath grouper work that we've done since 2006, notably in the Mesoamerican Reef, but also in Panama. So one of the key questions that the nascent Atlantic Goliath grouper network has asked is, what is the conservation status of Goliath grouper in our sites, countries, or regions? And I'd like to start off by mentioning the Mesoamerican Reef, which is a 1,000-kilometer long reef span that spans Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras. I've been working there since 1998 on a host of other species, but started working in this area since, I'd say, 2005, 2006 on Goliath grouper. And one of the seminal studies that we did in 2006, 2007 established one of the first baselines for Goliath grouper in Belize, notably. And what we found was really critically low numbers of Goliath grouper, with the majority of animals either being landed or caught through fisheries independent modalities, or even cited as being juvenile or definitely not the age to reproduce. And so that was a concern, and that was in 2006, 2007. And since in 2011 to 2022, we've been conducting fisheries independent monitoring, where we're continuing to find a dearth of Goliath grouper, with only 5 records really noted across the Mesoamerican Reef. And although our methods are maybe not perfectly suited to Goliath grouper, you would still expect them to show up in greater quantities than they are. Unfortunately, after all of the work that we conducted in southern Belize, we identified a good slot limit for them because there was no interest in fully protecting Goliath grouper in Belize. A slot limit was determined between 40 and 80 centimeters, which would highlight a very rapid growth period for them. There's strong recruitment, so rapid growth, and low methyl mercury, which we found to be actually quite high in animals that were above 55 centimeters. So we were trying to find a happy medium. We had a lot of fishers actually on board with conservation of a key nursery site, and that would be the Paynes Creek and Port Honduras Marine Reserve areas in southern Belize. This is a critical site because what we've also noticed is that it is feeding as a source into the rest of the Mesoamerican Reef. We've noticed that Goliath grouper are not couch potatoes. They actually move out from the Port Honduras and Paynes Creek area in southern Belize out to the 4 reef areas or to other reef areas, both in the barrier reef of Belize, but also into Mexico, into the offshore atolls of Belize, and all the way over to Honduras. We have also been told that by Guatemalan fishers that they have captured Goliath grouper. It's unsure whether that happened to be in Guatemalan waters or potentially in southern Belize waters as well, where Guatemalan fishers do occasionally fish. So management and conservation efforts moving forward in this particular region really have to be regional in scale, regional in scope. And so this network is really coming to fruition at a perfect time. Unfortunately, across all of these 4 countries, we still have no protective measures for Goliath grouper. They have been considered in Belize, but there's been no protection enacted as of yet. So moving down the Central American Isthmus to Panama, we're working in 2 key sites which merge both red mangrove, large extents of red mangrove, estuarine sites, as well as offshore coral reef areas. And that would be Bocas del Toro in the northwest of the country, and in the northeast of the country on the Atlantic side, the autonomous indigenous comarca of Gunayala. What we found there is very similar results, only 5 records over Bocas del Toro and Gunayala, and that's across multiple sampling periods over the course of 5 years. Anecdotal reports from fishers indicate that the captures are very infrequent, but there's not been any dedicated landings work done there at this point. And just like in the MAR, the Mesoamerican Reef, there are no laws protecting Atlantic Goliath grouper at this time. So where do we go from here in terms of research initiatives that would be helpful to recovering the populations of Goliath grouper? And I think that that's really critical. We need to have them be very management and conservation focused. And I think we have a great opportunity here in a lot of data poor countries to gather local ecological knowledge. Several of us have done that type of work already. And that's helped to identify some hotspots, some critical habitats, such as nursery sites or maybe even spawning sites that used to exist. And I think we need to take it one step further. And when we're actually gathering some of this information, this local ecological knowledge, to also get some of the proposals for how to best manage and recover populations from the same fishers and coastal communities. I think it's very important, once we've identified that there is some kind of landings or regular landings of Goliath grouper, to systematize the landings and be able to get more information on them, especially try to determine age and growth of a particular population and more. We're really needing to up the ante on finding spawning aggregations. Those that we had identified in Belize and one in Honduras appear to be extirpated. So utilization of some of the new technologies, such as acoustics, might be helpful in us identifying whether any of the Goliath groupers that are growing out, leaving the recruitment area and going back out to the reef, are actually traveling to those spawning sites. And they're clearly spawning, because we are still seeing recruitment of Goliath grouper into the mangrove areas as juveniles. So one of the last aspects that I think would be really key and critical to research is the movement behavior and environmental preferences that Goliath grouper have. I think this is important now that we know that, for at least in the Western Caribbean, Mesoamerican Reef, Goliath grouper are moving throughout the MAR, but also in light of the threats from coastal development. We'll talk about threats in the next slide, but threats from coastal development, in fact, we can go to it now, coastal development, pollution especially, but also climate change. So we already know fisheries as a huge threat. And of course, the lack of food security or food, impacts to food security are increasing, and people are going to be fishing more near shore, which of course is going to impact our recruiting Goliath grouper, who tend to recruit to those red mangrove areas along the coast. So we're potentially going to see a dip in recruitment, and so we need to be able to monitor that. But we also really need to see what the impacts are of climate change and coastal development and pollution on Goliath grouper, because I think those are going to be significant, as you're seeing a lot of coastal transformation throughout the countries, at least where we are working. And there's an added threat we're seeing, not just with the changes in temperature in nearshore coastal areas, but also in localized dead zones, in part due to pollution, but also a new threat coming in the form of arrivals of sargassum that are creating deoxygenated zones and are leading to mass fish die-offs in some of the areas where the accumulation of sargassum is particularly large. So how this might impact Goliath grouper will be really important to assess, because we don't see a solution to the sargassum accumulation in the near future. We feel that it's only going to increase over time. So really, the Atlantic Goliath grouper network is perfectly poised at this point to help develop a regionally coherent voice, not just for research, but also conservation, and provide policy guidance to not only coastal communities, but also managers, MPA managers, and fisheries departments and governments. I think standardization of our monitoring and research methods and protocols, advocating for building of local capacities is absolutely critical. We need champions, all the sites moving forward. And then that will enable us to cross-compare between sites, countries, and years. And this is really kind of the backbone of what Mar Alliance does. So we're excited to promote that as really one of the things that we'd like to achieve with the AGGN. And we need to figure out, what is our collective vision? How can we possibly rewild with Goliath grouper, bring back these populations? I think this is important, because in the areas where the water is, there's enough clarity, there's also the opportunity to improve tourism and provide that as an economic supplementation or alternative to actually fishing Goliath grouper. So we should bear this in mind, and we should look at how the potential for repopulating or rewilding can also be transformed into a lucrative coastal tourism for the stakeholder communities. Because ultimately, and thank you, Walt Stearns, for this lovely picture, our vision is one of many Goliath grouper, many large Goliath grouper, like this wonderful aggregation seen off the coast of Florida and Jupiter. And so that's particularly my vision, as well as rewilding Goliath grouper, not only in the countries where I work, but hopefully throughout its range. And I think that the Atlantic Goliath grouper network is going to be a wonderful step to helping us achieve that particular goal. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Rachel, for the talk. Yeah, these images from Walt Stearns are really amazing, you know, lots of huge Goliath groupers together during an aggregation. Amazing. Okay, so our next speaker, I'm going to call Dr. Roberta Aguiar dos Santos. She's an oceanographer with a with a PhD in biological oceanography, and currently an environmental analyst at the National Center for Research and Conservation of Southeast and South Brazilian Marine Biodiversity, known as CEPSU, of Chico Mendes Institute of Biodiversity and Conservation. Dr. Roberta works with the assessment of the extinction risk and conservation of marine biodiversity, implementation of national action plans, research and monitoring of marine biodiversity, especially associated with fisheries. Okay, just before you start, Roberta, I would like to give an announce here, just to inform that our official channel is the Zoom platform. So here you can have access to the translation channels from Portuguese to English, and also the Brazilian Sign Language interpretation, okay? So, Roberta, welcome. Seja bem-vinda.
Obrigada de novo pelo convite. Eu vou passar para vocês, então, um pouquinho das informações sobre, principalmente, o processo de avaliação do risco de extinção, né, dessa espécie. Vamos passar aqui para a apresentação, então. Estão vendo?
Sim, só falta o modo apresentação.
Agora?
Não, está no modo apresentador.
Para mim está aqui já como apresentando.
Está no modo apresentador.
Que estranho. Que a gente testou, né?
Acho
agora,
que
Para
Deixa eu
mim
ver.
tá normal aqui. Deixa eu ver se eu consigo mudar aqui. Eu estou como só, vocês estão vendo a tela, mas não estão vendo.
A gente está vendo o modo de apresentador, que tem as anotações ao lado, todos os detalhes.
Entendi.
Qualquer coisa, vê se você consegue, qualquer coisa eu já mudo aqui para minha
Eu
pasta.
vou fazer o seguinte. Vocês estão vendo essa parte aqui com slide, né? Aqui
Isto.
tá na outra tela. É por isso.
Isso.
Foi para outra tela. Deixa eu sair daqui. E agora? Vocês estão na modo apresentação fora da tela?
Isso, o modo.
Mas consegue enxergar? Porque não vai fazer problema ter aqui um.
Você quer que eu coloque, Roberta? Tá, pode ser assim dá também.
É por isso que eu digo, vocês vão ver só a outra parte, mas acho que não vai ter muito problema.
Tranquilo, pode seguir.
Tá. Então, né, Roberta, eu sou do centro de pesquisa do Instituto Chico Mendes, que é do Ministério do Meio Ambiente, né, aqui no Brasil. Então, vamos falar um pouquinho da avaliação do risco de extinção, né, e a importância da pesquisa sobre meros em relação a essa avaliação. Que essa avaliação do risco de extinção no Brasil é feita pelo Instituto Chico Mendes, né, de biodiversidade, de conservação da biodiversidade, que é, como eu falei, uma instituição governamental, e ela utiliza as categorias e critérios, né, a metodologia da IUCN, como forma oficial de avaliação da fauna brasileira. Desde 2017, nós contamos com um sistema para fazer essa avaliação. Então, esse sistema é integrado, né, um sistema com informações sobre todas as espécies que são avaliadas, e isso é feito, é claro, em conjunto com muitos pesquisadores, dentro de oficinas de avaliação. Depois a gente vai ver as etapas, um pouquinho das etapas desse processo, e nós contamos demais, então, com as instituições de pesquisa, os pesquisadores, mas também tentamos levar ao máximo, claro, com uma apresentação não tão desejada, ou seja, não como a gente desejaria, de atores da sociedade, né, de organizações não governamentais e de associações, por exemplo, quando trabalhamos com recursos pesqueiros, né, de associações de pescadores, de sindicatos, tentando abranger a maior parte da população possível dentro dessas avaliações, não só com os pesquisadores. Também trazemos aí representantes de outros ministérios, né, por exemplo, os próprios órgãos responsáveis pela pesca no Brasil, como é o caso hoje de uma Secretaria de Pesca que temos. Essas etapas, então, no Brasil, elas têm uma etapa toda de preparação das informações das espécies, da organização das oficinas, e depois a gente tem a etapa propriamente dita de avaliação, tendo passado por uma fase anterior de consultas à sociedade e a pesquisadores específicos, dependendo da espécie que a gente esteja trabalhando, até chegar realmente numa oficina de trabalho, onde a gente tem grupos de espécies a serem avaliadas. Chegamos, então, à etapa final, ou seja, no Brasil, além da gente ter a etapa de avaliação, já com pesquisadores e alguns representantes e atores da sociedade, a gente tem uma etapa de validação dessa categorização, ou seja, alguns especialistas em critérios e categorias da metodologia utilizada da IUCN, a gente trabalha com aquelas fichas trabalhadas de cada espécie para poder ter a validação do critério, que às vezes tem alguns ajustes para serem feitos, até mesmo de mudança de categoria, quando é observado que teve alguma espécie de equívoco ou vício mesmo na avaliação. E depois, a gente está ainda em elaboração, não conseguimos terminar esse módulo, que é o módulo de publicação, né? Ou seja, para que fique exposta a avaliação e todo o conteúdo que gerou essa avaliação, né, nesse processo. A gente teve o primeiro ciclo que se encerrou, né, em 2014, onde a gente teve 12.254 espécies avaliadas no Brasil, sendo que os vertebrados se tentou avaliar todos os vertebrados, e os invertebrados são avaliados de forma por escolha, né, por seleção de alguns grupos. Das espécies marinhas, né, onde está o Meros, o Epinephelus e itajara, nós tivemos 30 oficinas, 200 especialistas e 2.178 espécies avaliadas, sendo que 160 estiveram em categoria de ameaça de extinção, e o Epinephelus e itajara, como vocês veem, ficam como criticamente em perigo no Brasil. Nós já estamos no segundo ciclo, né, esse segundo ciclo deve terminar, ele começou em 2015 e deve terminar em 2023, era para ter terminado em 2022, mas em razão da pandemia, a gente teve que estender. Então, ele já está finalizando. O Mero já foi reavaliado no Brasil, ele já ficou com a categoria de criticamente em perigo, mas ainda está faltando a última etapa, como vocês viram no slide anterior, que é da validação. Eu acredito que no caso de Mero não vai ter problema nenhum em relação a isso, né? Mas ele está numa última etapa aí de validação. Para esse segundo ciclo que a gente tem. Bom, em relação à avaliação e o que a gente tem de medidas de conservação, porque dentro desse processo de avaliação são vistos, né, também as medidas de conservação necessárias. Como foi dito já antes, né, nós já temos moratória do Mero, né, já por própria percepção dos pescadores da diminuição de suas populações, desde 2002, né, que na época era o Instituto Brasileiro do Meio Ambiente, na UBAMA, e que teve sua prorrogação em 2007 e teve uma nova portaria já por outros dois órgãos, né, que é o Ministério da Pesca e do Ministério do Meio Ambiente, em 2015, propondo ainda a moratória. E é interessante se observar que, em 2014, nós já tínhamos o Mero na lista de espécie ameaçada de extinção oficial do Brasil. E para o governo brasileiro, estar numa lista de espécie ameaçada de extinção já lhe confere proteção integral a priori, ou seja, a espécie não pode ser transportada, comercializada, capturada. E, inclusive, dentro de licenciamento ambiental, ela passa a ter um foco importante, desde 2014. Mesmo assim, foi editada em 2015 a moratória do Mero, porque pode ter situações em que seja autorizada a pesca, como é o caso de se fazer um plano de recuperação para uma espécie que tenha desejo de uso, né, que é o caso último que eu coloquei ali, ou ainda o que aconteceu, infelizmente, com a nossa portaria, né? Essa portaria, ela teve liminares em que havia momentos em que ela estava valendo e momentos que ela não estava valendo por questionamentos. Hoje ela está plenamente valendo, ela teve uma atualização recentemente, né, que ainda mantém o Mero como espécie ameaçada de extinção, mesmo não tendo sido validada, porque foi utilizado a lista anterior. E outra coisa importante, dentro de conservação, no termo de políticas públicas, nós temos os planos de ação nacional. Né? No Brasil, nós temos o Plano de Ação Nacional para a Conservação dos Ambientes Coralinos, que é o PAN-Corais, e a espécie, né? O Epinephelus itajara está nesse plano de ação, onde, em impacto com a sociedade, são definidas ações estratégicas, né? Para que se tenha um foco nessa espécie ameaçada de extinção, e que tipo de ações e medidas nós podemos fazer, né? Então, como política pública, que já está dentro também, como o Brasil assina, né, a Convenção da Diversidade Biológica, então essa necessidade de fazer os planos de ação para a conservação dessas espécies. E nós temos, como eu estava comentando antes, também uma possibilidade de plano de recuperação quando a espécie tem desejo de uso, né? Claro que no plano de recuperação tu pode prever, por exemplo, uma moratória de 10 anos, uma moratória de 5, dependendo como se estabeleça. Mas, como eu disse, no Brasil, o plano de recuperação tem essa previsão de uso, então a gente tem que tomar bastante cuidado com o que a gente quer, né? E finalizando, então, eu acho que eu já vi várias das apresentações anteriores mostrando, né, a importância dessa rede colaborativa, sobretudo internacional. Então, para complementar mais ou menos o que a gente já viu, e a gente já está fazendo isso com a Mangona, né, com o Cacaristauros, né, as políticas públicas direcionadas, ou seja, acho que essa rede vai possibilitar a gente trabalhar melhor até as próprias políticas públicas voltadas à conservação nacionalmente e regionalmente no sentido de Atlântico, né? Talvez a gente consiga trabalhar entre governos e entre instituições, né, estrangeiras no sentido de trabalhar a conservação como um todo, já que a gente sabe o quanto que eles estão também integrados. Essa é a minha apresentação. Obrigada.
Obrigada, Roberta. Obrigada pela sua apresentação.
Só descompartilhou para mim?
Ainda não, ainda está compartilhado aqui.
Não estou, tá só new share, não estou conseguindo descompartilhar. Vocês conseguem descompartilhar?
Consigo,
Então,
consigo. Pronto, descompartilhei já. E agora eu vou convidar para falar para vocês, vai ser o Attila Bertottini, que está fazendo toda essa apresentação aqui. Ele é oceanógrafo com doutoramento em Ecologia e Recursos Naturais e atualmente professor visitante na Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina. Coordena também o componente de investigação do projeto Meros do Brasil e é membro do grupo de especialistas de meros e budiões e peixe-papagaio da União Internacional para a Conservação da Natureza e UCN. Ele vai falar sobre a Rede Meros do Brasil e as experiências dos projetos. Seja bem-vindo, Attila.
Muito obrigado, Elise. I'm going to do my talk in English, okay? Can you see my presentation? Please.
Sim, sim, perfeito. Pode seguir.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all the speakers. I'm going to close this talk today with a presentation from Meros do Brasil. I'm not going to present results itself, but I'm going to show what we do, and I'll try to answer some questions at the end, okay? So the Projeto Meros do Brasil is entitled as the Conservation of the Atlantic Goliath Groupers in Brazil, Epinephelus itajara, and associated marine and coastal ecosystems along the Brazilian coast. Okay, the project is about to complete 20 years of existence. It started back in 2000, and it expanded the partnerships from a single project in the northern coast of Santa Catarina in South Brazil to 4 states, and nowadays we count on 9 states along the Brazilian coast. We have some, just a second. We have some objectives like research and conservation, governance. We work also with public policy and communication and environmental education. So the execution of the project is only possible through a network of partners, which is called nowadays as Rede Meros do Brasil. It's Meros do Brasil network, okay, with a series of institutions working toward the conservation of the Goliath grouper. As Jonas presented in the beginning, Instituto Meros do Brasil is the institution that nowadays works with all, concentrates the network, okay? So Meros do Brasil is presented in 9 states. I'm going just to show you in this map, from Pará, Belém, with Universidade Federal do Pará, in Pernambuco with Universidade Federal de Pernambuco, Alagoas, the Federal University of Alagoas. In Bahia, we have the cultural movement Arte Manha, which is an Afro-Indigenous movement. At Espírito Santo, we have the Universidade Federal do Espírito Santo. Rio de Janeiro, Associação Amigos do Museu Nacional. In São Paulo, we have Instituto de Pesca. Paraná, Museu de História Natural Capão da Embuia. And in Santa Catarina, Instituto Comar. Okay, we are now in our 4th round of partnership and sponsorship with Petrobras, and we have just spread for these 9 states in the last 2 years of project, sheltering 46 municipalities along 1,500 kilometers of the coast. Okay, we have a direct public estimated in 29,000 people and an eventual public of about 2 million people being related with some of the actions and activities of the project. Our partnerships are in 86 institutions, and we have been working with 12 species, okay? So the Goliath grouper is a flag species for us. We have many main efforts in protecting these species is studying and understanding the ecology and biology, but we also shelter another 11 species which are threatened along the Brazilian coast. Most of them are in the list which Roberto just presented. Okay, and we are in some ILTER sites, the International Long-Term Ecological Research Sites. We've been in a research group at the National Research Council, CNPq, since 2013, with about 20 researchers in this group. And in this group, we also have some members of the Groupers and Rosses Specialist Group for the IUCN. This picture is just a joke, okay? We have some great people, funny people. We're surrounded by nice partners. And of course, they can all be very serious when it's needed, okay? This is a picture of our last encounter before the pandemic. So we're about to have a new encounter soon, I hope. So what do we do? What do we do for the conservation of the Goliath groupers? So in the 2 decades, Projeto Meros do Brasil has offered the main information for the recovery of populations along the Brazilian coast. Our research focus are the conservation biology of the species, understand population biology issues. We have been working with marine pollution as well, genetics, environmental valuation of the species, aquaculture, and the citizen science. Okay, this is a picture of a sport fisherman, and we have received it recently about 1,000 register of interactions of the Goliath grouper with the sport fishing. We have an action besides the scientific research with the public policy, working toward the knowledge of these threatened species, education for sustainability, also the environmental communication, and the ocean literacy as well. We have been working with local traditional knowledge, as Rachel already said. This is the basis of the knowledge in many of the areas. Traditional communities, some of our collaborators are fisherwomen. We really care about the gender equality every time as we can, more and more. Also, racial inclusion. These girls are working on craft wood in Bahia with Artimanha Cultural Movement. Also, we have a focus on the first childhood as asked by Petrobras. So this is a main action of the project, working with this public, which is very special for us, and also disabled people. So every time we can include more and more people which are disabled, like handicapped people, low vision, and blind people. We've been working to include more and more these publics in our activities and spreading the knowledge for them also. When we are asking how the Goliath grouper conservation status in Brazil, how is it? So nowadays, the Goliath grouper is a protected species. We have a moratorium on the species, which will end next year. So we'll have another great round of getting the information together to present to the Brazilian government and decide what we are going to do with the Goliath groupers. And in our last evaluation, the assessment of the species published in 2018, the Goliath grouper along the Brazilian coast is considered critically endangered. Okay, this picture on your right, it's the register of the Brazilian Goliath grouper records. Okay, this specimen weighed 328 kilograms, and it was fished before the moratorium. So what would be possible to achieve for the conservation of the Atlantic Goliath grouper from the perspective of this network? Okay, as proposed by many of you, As you could see in the presentations before, we want to find knowledge gaps, and it would be really nice if we could find partners along the African coast. We are searching for them. We know they are in the conference. We already got some contacts, but if you are there, get in touch with us. Think on standardized research methods, and this is very important for the network where we can exchange information, methods, and research lines. And propose also guidelines for country based on successful experiences. As far as we can see, we are in a kind of time machine. We can see very different situations in different countries, from countries that have been protecting the Goliath groupers to countries that have no restrictions at all to the fisheries, and we can see very different situations of the stocks of the Goliath grouper. So I believe this share of information among the partners would be essential for us to reach good results regarding the conservation of these species. So I'd like to thank you, everybody. And we can continue with Elise on this presentation. Thank you.
Obrigada, Átila. Obrigada a todos. Gente, agradeço quem participou da interação no Mentimeter. Agora a gente vai estar mostrando para vocês o resultado. Quem não participou, pega o link, ainda dá tempo. A gente vai trazer aqui para vocês os resultados e ainda dá tempo de vocês participarem e entrarem aqui na nossa enquete. Para a gente é muito importante ouvir vocês e interagir, para a gente entender o que vocês estão pensando aí enquanto a gente fala aqui. Também a gente tem um momento de perguntas e respostas logo em seguida. Quem ainda não colocou lá no Q&A, no QIA, as suas perguntas e respostas, por favor, insiram, que a gente vai ter um momento super bacana com todos os palestrantes aqui para poder falar. Então, vocês estão vendo aí o QR Code. Quem ainda não contribuiu, pode pegar o QR Code, o código ou o link que a gente coloca no chat, que já está ali no chat, e contribuam. Vamos ver como é que ficou os resultados aqui, Átila. Eu estou curiosa aqui para saber o que o pessoal botou nas nossas perguntas. Vamos lá, pessoal. Tivemos 8 participações aqui e a nossa pergunta foi: como você tem contribuído para a conservação marinha no contexto onde você vive? E o que o pessoal respondeu aqui? Protegendo espécies e habitats. Escrevam também no chat, quem está aí no chat e não pôde participar, escrevam o que vocês têm feito, também a gente pode ler do chat. E como que vocês estão protegendo espécies e habitats? Participo como supervisor ambiental no projeto Meros do Brasil, através da atividade de educação ambiental. Que bacana, gente. É super importante essas atividades de educação ambiental. O outro aqui, trabalho com avaliação de risco da espécie, apoio à fiscalização ambiental, olha só, implementação do Plano de Ação Nacional Pan-Corais, integrando parcerias de pesquisa e conservação no litoral brasileiro. Que bacana, pessoal. É gostoso ver isso, né? O pessoal aqui participando e também contribuindo na prática, porque eu acho que é isso que é importante, né, Átila? Quer comentar alguma coisa, Átila?
No, we can wait and see the answers. Okay.
O pessoal está entrando aqui, já aumentou para 9, né? E o pessoal está também contribuindo no chat. Agora sim, agora gostei, pessoal. A gente mostrou que vocês estão vindo. Sou supervisora de pesquisa no PMB, no Espírito Santo, atualmente fazendo doutorado em análise de diversidade genética da espécie, colaborando com a pesquisa de conservação de ecossistemas e espécies marinhas, atuando na divulgação, educação, percepção da vida para a sociedade, vivendo de forma sustentável e próxima à natureza. Aí também tem da Michelle a contribuição, Develop a Citizen Science Project to Help Report Groupers. Gente, muito bacana. É muito bacana a gente ver, e aí eu acho uma coisa bastante interessante, que cada um pode fazer alguma coisa para a proteção dos meros no Brasil, né, e no mundo, né? A gente está aqui numa conferência internacional, então acho que cada um pode fazer a sua parte para isso acontecer, e vocês veem, às vezes, coisas simples, né? Atividade de educação ambiental, você falar, enfim, divulgação, tanto material lindo, gente. Vocês já seguiram o Instagram do Meros, o quanto material lindo que a gente vê lá. Cola aí pra gente, Juan, no chat, o Instagram do Meros, para o pessoal poder curtir. Então, é possível fazer. Átila, quer comentar?
Yeah, would you present our cloud of words, right? The next step. So I'm getting the questions for the
Vamos.
speakers and also people who are in the room.
Legal, vou agora para a nuvem de palavras e só para fechar essa primeira sessão aqui, o Thiago também colocou, participo como educador ambiental, mergulhador, pesquisador, no auxílio às atividades de campo junto ao projeto Meros e com atividades artesanais com plástico retirado das praias no norte de Santa Catarina, junto ao Instituto Comar. Gente, que bacana, muito bom. O Instagram do Meros está ali no chat para vocês. E agora vamos ver a nuvem de palavras, o que veio mais forte, né? Em uma palavra, como você deseja que o oceano esteja após essa década? Limpo, saudável, sustentável, vivo, amado por todos, rico, limpos, muito bom. Eu acho que é isso, vou passar agora para um momento super bacana, que é o momento de perguntas e respostas, e o Átila vai estar fazendo essas perguntas aí para os palestrantes. Então agora a gente vai colocar na tela todos os palestrantes, só um minutinho o Juan já vai incluir todos vocês aqui na tela, para a gente ter esse momento bacana. Quem ainda não fez sua pergunta, por favor, coloque lá no chat, lá no Q&A, que a gente vai estar trazendo para cá. Vamos lá.
Okay. Can I call the first question, Elise?
Yes.
All right. So we have a question here from Dr. Michelle Scherer. Okay, a great friend for Dr. Chris. Okay, is there any evidence of higher or different toxicity due to deep water horizon disaster and surfactant pollution?
Hello, Michelle, and thank you for that.
Surfactant pollution.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this doesn't necessarily pertain to Goliath grouper that aren't at the depths that those studies were done on the effects of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and the surfactants that were then laid down to try to clean up the oil. But there was a study by Florida State University showing, looking at PAHs and other products of the oil that were higher in tilefish and some other benthic species that were higher due to the oil spill. Yeah, so that's the main study that came out recently that showed that there was an effect of oil on the fish, and that showed higher concentrations of mercury potentially related to that spill. So you know, if the oil did make some passes near shore, then that certainly could have had a bigger effect on some of the species that encountered, including Goliath grouper that encountered the spill as well, probably. But there's no study to support that that effect near shore. But thank you for that question.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Michelle. All right. Can go for our next question. I'm going to read it in Portuguese, okay? Bom dia. Gostaríamos de saber como integrar e colaborar com a Rede de Conservação Meros do Atlântico. Estamos trabalhando um projeto no litoral do norte de São Paulo, mergulhando com o mero. Busca revitalizar populações de meros nessa região através da reprodução da espécie em cativeiro. Temos um apoio da Fundação Boticário Ambiental, que seria muito interessante a troca de informações e conhecimento com os integrantes da rede. Obrigada. Pergunta da Cláudia Kerr. Okay. I can call Mr. Jonas and maybe Eduardo Sanchez, which works with the aquaculture component of the project. And just an important reminder here is that this event is a kickoff for the launch of this network of the Atlantic conservation of the Goliath grouper. Okay, Mr. Jonas.
Oi, bom dia. Obrigado pela pergunta, Cláudia. Cláudia também é uma conhecida aqui do Brasil, né, que trabalha com reprodução de peixes marinhos. Como a Átila falou, nesse momento é a pedra inicial da criação da rede. Então, nesse próximo ano, até o evento do ano que vem, todos os parceiros e possíveis parcerias novas, não só do Brasil, mas do mundo inteiro. Então, quem está assistindo, os palestrantes também, que tenham mais pessoas e indicações. A gente tem esse próximo ano aí para estar conversando, dialogando com parceiros e futuros parceiros para estar efetivando essa rede no evento do ano que vem. E, Cláudia, podemos entrar em contato depois do evento para conversar sobre e dialogar sobre a rede, tá bom? Obrigado pela pergunta.
Okay, anybody else would like to answer? It's okay. All right, so I'll go on for the next questions from Michele also. Does this network include the African coasts on the Atlantic? So Michele, this is really a target of the network. Find partners along the African coast. We have invited for this first meeting Dr. Ugulai. He studied here in Brazil also, but he's native from São Tomé and Príncipe, and nowadays he's also working as a teacher at the University of São Tomé. But he couldn't make, but we'll continue our contacts with him, and we also have mapped some very nice contacts along the African coast, some countries that work with turtle monitoring and also fisheries monitoring. So they are really key targets for this network, and we really do want to know what's going on with the Goliath grouper along the African coast. This is a question that we must start answering instead of just thinking that it may be gone to extinction there, but we already have some information from spear fishermen, some old records also from spear fishermen along the Gulf do Gabão, the Gabon Gulf, and also along offshore platforms, and they must be around for sure. So it's a matter of finding the partners and expanding the network. We count on everybody to do that. Does anybody want to say anything?
I was just going to say, yeah, Felicia and I received also some anecdotal data that there are potentially some Goliath grouper being sighted on the west coast of Africa. And I don't know, maybe this is our discussion of how to pool resources to try to do studies over there, because if we don't have research biologists that are targeting that species for study, then we're going to be stuck with only anecdotal data. So maybe we can all have a discussion after this meeting as the launch to this network to try to figure out how we can facilitate that sort of research.
Yeah, I would like just to include that we've been in contact with an institution along French Guiana, Amandine and Marion, but they also could not make, I believe Amandine is online with us here, and they've been moving and changing things there. They couldn't make it, but we are in contact. I think they will be very important for this network, since they are working specifically on the fisheries of the Goliath groupers along the Guyana, the French Guiana.
And Cuba as well have we've been able
Yeah.
to touch base with Fabian or anyone who was doing work there, because that's a very important species in Cuba as well.
Yeah, I invited Fabian and Tamara, but they did not give me any feedback, so we couldn't include them. But they are for sure good people working at Jardins de la Reina, where they still have some nice groupers there.
I think we can continue to try to grow, and include more people as we move forward with this network too. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. And I had the same problem that Chris did, getting in touch with Fabian. And he had come over here Chris, I think you were with us when we went out, and so he could understand the capture techniques. But I kind of think he's dropped out. I have somebody I can check with, but he hasn't answered me.
Okay.
But it's an important area, so however we can, if it's not Fabian, maybe there's another contact we can dig through to find, so that we have all of our these important regions covered.
All right. Okay, so I would like to call Dr. Beatriz Ferreira. She is our coordinator of Meros in Pernambuco, to ask a question to Felicia. Elise, can you put Beatriz here with us?
I'm here. Oh, thank you. Hello, everyone. It's thank you for the excellent presentations. It was really nice to listen and to learn so much about our Goliath group. So thank you, Attila. My question to Felicia is if you guys know of if freshwater inputs during extreme flood events. We just had an extreme flood event in Brazil, in the northeast Brazil now. So on top of colder water, if a freshwater input that's often carries a lot of pollutants have caused death on juvenile Goliath group, or if anyone has ever recorded death events associated to these extreme situations. And also, the other question, I guess, is for everyone. Alfonso said that, Rachel said that as well, but it's not here, is how we can deal with this problem of food security. And as hunger and poverty advances throughout many countries in the world, fishes that occur in estuaries and any resources in estuary are, of course, under threat as well. And people have no other options, particularly because these areas are being degraded by the same events that are striking this population. So I think this is something we need to tackle. And so I just want to see if anyone has thought or any examples of actions. That's certainly something we have to think about. And then just adding that we sure need to reassess the Goliath group.
Oh, yes. Absolutely. Well, and in answer to, let me make sure I'm not muted. In answer to your first question, we do have large freshwater inputs. Mostly they're coming from the Lake Okeechobee region, where there are large canals that go from Lake Okeechobee and kind of central South Florida that go out both to the East Coast and to the West Coast, and they release enormous amounts of water, eutrophied water, low oxygen. There are reefs offshore, certainly on the West Coast, that are just kind of covered with a black slime from those events. The effect on a Goliath grouper, we don't know, but they're certainly right in the area where that occurs on both sides of the channel, both sides of Florida, both coasts of Florida. I think it might be a good idea for me to check with Koenig and see if he has any data on that. I don't believe that he does.
I could chime in really quick, Felicia,
okay.
if you can hear me. So, nothing has been published on that yet, but for the state managers, Florida Fish and Wildlife, is doing a study right now and they've shown the Goliath grouper do move. The juveniles move from the mangroves during high flow events, especially cold water events. So there's some work being done on that right now. And so we'll see how productive the results are, but yeah.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Okay. I believe Beatriz also has a question for Roberta. Can you make it, Bea?
Oh, I think she answered in the chat or somewhere. My question was, well, first is that, of course, Goliath grouper is not protected by these general measures because they change so much and so fast. So a specific moratorium is still very necessary because it flags an important case, and that's different from the other ones. But I think you mentioned this, and I was asking you about the 148 ordinance, if there was any. I heard you saying that it mentions that Goliath grouper is not included, but I was not sure, so that's why I wrote in the chat.
Na verdade, a 148 ela manteve o mero. É só porque, como ele não foi validado no segundo ciclo, ele ficou igual, né? Só mudou um pouquinho os critérios, na verdade, né? A gente colocou lá também a questão da poluição como um problema. Mas, em sendo validado, uma coisa que é importante saber, no Brasil, né, a lista em si, ela já dá uma proteção a priori, independente de como é a fiscalização, etc. Mas, assim, sempre tem aquelas questões de que há possibilidade de autorização. Então, eu acho que é bom ter bem clara a questão da moratória, tanto que saiu em 2015, mesmo tendo a lista sido publicada em 2014. Então, com a 148, que é de 2022, agora, né, recente, mantém-se o mero na lista, tá? E a ideia é se fazer uma publicação nova a cada ano, mantendo-se o que já foi avaliado, que entra ou sai, né, numa avaliação já validada do risco de extinção. Então, o mero continua, mas nada impede de se fazer uma proposta de moratória, porque ela vence ano que vem, né, em 2023. Então, se é a proposta, né, ou se tem não, acho que a gente pode ter uma pescaria monitorada em algum lugar. Ou seja, e aí, se for essa a saída, eu acho que entra em plano de recuperação, né? Mas se a ideia for manter a moratória, diante da situação que ela está no Brasil todo, eu acho que nada impede de ter como teve em 2015. Era isso.
Obrigada, Roberta, é isso mesmo, tá? Ótimo. Eu só queria adicionar, Átila, em relação a, se eu falar, o pessoal traduz, né? A possibilidade de mortalidade do mero pela água doce, que esses eventos extremos aqui no Nordeste causaram morte de muitos crustáceos, muitos caranguejos, né? E que eles também saem quando a água doce vem. Eles sobem, né? Eles são animais estuarinos, acostumados com isso, mas não houve tempo, aparentemente. Então, eventos extremos e essas mudanças climáticas associadas a outros, né, problemas locais, eu acho que entra muito na avaliação. A gente tem uma dificuldade de colocar isso nas avaliações da IUCN, porque são problemas gerais, né? Não específicos. Mas algumas espécies têm esses problemas especificamente no caso delas. Então, eu acho que é importante relatarmos, né, porque isso é novo, né? A gente tem questões novas surgindo. A questão da segurança alimentar, por exemplo, é uma questão que agora nos atinge muitos países no mundo, muitas regiões, países até desenvolvidos que não tinham esses problemas antes. Então, coloca em xeque, né, alguns valores. Então, eu acho que isso a conservação tem que absorver isso e pensar em estratégias para lidar com isso daqui para frente. Acho que esse é um desafio para nós também. Obrigada, gente. Muito bom.
I'll just quickly follow up on that. As Dr. Coleman had mentioned before, so we do see these large freshwater flow events that cause that further grow the harmful algal blooms especially off the west coast in the Gulf of Mexico. And even though Goliath grouper can swim out of some minor events, there's been large mortalities because of those harmful algal blooms. So we do know that they're happening in large mortality events, but they're not being quantified. So to your point, yes, that needs to be incorporated into our management because we don't know how many we're losing of that species and many others. So some studies are ongoing right now to understand flow effects on, and then actually we're doing one on some other species right now as part of our group in the estuaries. But on Goliath grouper, they're difficult because the juveniles are only present in certain areas of Florida that are more difficult to study the effects of the flow on. And then to your other point on food security, I think, without giving specific examples, I think, proper sustainable management is the way to go so that the fish are around for sustaining food, as we move forward. When you don't have proper management of species, you have loss of species. So maybe you can go out and get a fish today, but tomorrow you're not going to be able to. So proper management for sustainable food resources is something that really needs to be, the way that we do things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Átila, você está com o microfone desligado.
All right. So we're about to finish in less than 10 minutes. So we have two more questions that I would like to share with you. One is for Chris, okay? So it's from Lorena Lopes. She is the supervisor of research in Espírito Santo for Meros do Brasil. And she says, I'm not sure, but I think you mentioned that juveniles of 50 centimeters already have high mercury levels. Why does this species has such higher levels than other grouper species? Do you know, Chris?
I think I think Rachel had mentioned that during her recorded presentation, because they did a separate study with Evers as the main author in 2007, I believe. But we also, we did a huge study, Felicia, myself and Dr. Koenig at Florida State University on mercury concentrations across all age groups, from juveniles through the adults. And part of the reason why they have such high mercury concentrations are because they're feeding in sediment, which inherently has a lot of the mercury, especially the methylated form, which bioaccumulates in tissues. So it's the way that they feed. The food that they feed on, mostly crabs, are not particularly high in mercury concentration, but because they're such long-lived and large fish that they end up accumulating a lot of this mercury over time. So even as juveniles, they're still fairly large, and you see a very strong, high positive correlation with age, size, and mercury concentration in their tissues. They are able to demethylate part of that in their liver and push that off into their eggs. And so that's why they have such high concentration of mercury in their eggs, which then has a reproductive effect. They're able to get rid of a little bit from their muscle tissue, but as they get older and older, that just continues to accumulate and they can't keep up with that. And we also talked about pollution near coastlines, and we did a spatial analysis to look at where hotspots of mercury in the species was as well. And it's highest near urban centers and where a lot of the freshwater flow enters into the estuaries and the ocean. So all of that is wrapped into pollution on top of their behavior and feeding ecology.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
And our final question here, it's for Felicia, Chris, and Alfonso, especially, from Dog Aldino, from Bahia, our party chief of Artimanha movement. He would like to know how and which traditional populations in the regions of the Caribbean and Florida are involved in the initiatives of Goliath grouper conservation. Do you have any words for him? So,
Alfonso, can you answer that? I don't know anything about what's going on outside of the US, really, except in Brazil now.
Good.
Alfonso, you're not muted, but the volume's not coming through.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There we go.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So actually the problem is really big in terms of trying to get any conservation initiative in Mexico. There is not any conservation initiative in Mexico in terms of moving forward. An example like Meros do Brasil. So it will be very convenient at this point of time, try to build an alliance or something to try to engage the managers and fishers and everybody, the consumers, to try to tell them that the Goliath is in a very critical situation here in Mexico. So I understand that the work done by the Meros de Brazil is incredible in terms of getting to the people, to the public, because any initiative, any scientific initiative or any kind of management initiative wouldn't be of value if you don't have the public support. We've been trying to manage the red grouper, that is the most important grouper here in the southern Gulf of Mexico, and is overexploited. And even it's overexploited, the fishery goes on, and the managers do nothing. I don't know, it's try to convince the consumers or the public or the audience. I would love to have more people involved, not only ourselves as scientists, but more people that try to give their opinion, to say, I would like to support, I would like to protect the brood stock. The brood stock is important. If you don't have the brood stock protected, you are doing nothing in terms of science. So I don't know how to engage. We need to do more materials like you, Meros de Brazil, are doing in Brazil, but trying to do that, to replicate that initiatives in other parts of the world, like in the region. And not only with the Atlantic Goliath, also with the Pacific Goliath, that we don't know anything. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say I would follow in the United States by saying that we don't have a large group. I think Meros de Brazil is very unique in what you do with education and outreach. Here, we have groups of stakeholders that engage in pro-conservation measures, like the dive community is huge for that. And then you see people turn up when our state managers of Florida Fish and Wildlife Service have commission meetings where people show up and have contradictory viewpoints and argue basically at the stand. We have the scientists like myself and Felicia and Chris, we go and speak on behalf of non-staff scientists. And then you got the dive community that is very pro support of conservation measures. And then you get the trophy spearfishers, and they have a huge community. And they seem to be the loudest many times, and they get up and they're the ones that are winning the fight right now because they're spreading misinformation on the species. So it's the amount of research that's being done that needs to continue and answer a lot of the data gaps. But it's also, education and outreach is a huge component of support for proper conservation management. And so without that, you get the community that is sort of at odds with each other. And then that's really, the failure of what's happening in the United States right now.
Yeah, I think we can really take a lesson from Meros and what they've been doing in terms of outreach and education. It's really impressive.
Thank you, Felicia. And thank you very much for answering the questions. I believe we just finished our time. It's 11 here in Brazil, 3 p.m. in Lisbon. And I'd like to thank you very much for this opportunity to be here and to make this kickoff for the network. And we are planning to launch an event next year as one of the aims of Projeto Meros do Brasil. And by then we can talk about how we are going to work, how are we going to add new partners, search for new partners, and make this technical meeting with more time and more people speaking about. And of course, we're going to start this partnership with many other people. Thank you very much. Jonas.
E agradecer também a participação de todos. Eu vejo essa rede que está sendo criada como uma máquina do tempo, né? A gente tem países que tem onde os meros ocorrem, que já tem legislações de proteção. A gente tem países que estão mais à frente em relação à educação ambiental e envolvimento de populações tradicionais que relacionam com o oceano e com a espécie, com os meros. Mas também a gente tem países que ainda não têm essas legislações, ainda não têm algum tipo de trabalho com as comunidades locais e leis específicas. Então, eu acho que a gente pode ver como se fosse uma máquina do tempo mesmo. Essa atuação em conjunto da rede vai poder fortalecer a conservação dos meros no Atlântico. Obrigado a todos vocês. Foi um prazer estar aqui hoje.
Jonas, só antes de fechar as portas, eu coloquei no chat de vocês a avaliação. Então, eu vou colocar aqui também o QR Code. Quem puder responder, eu agradeço que responda. Para a gente é muito importante a avaliação de vocês para que a gente possa fazer outros eventos como esse. Então, palavra final aí, Jonas. Obrigada.
Obrigado, Elise. Obrigado a todos.
Thank you, Elise.
Tchau, tchau.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Meet
All
you
right.
soon.
All right, set up the next meeting so we can all discuss
For
what to
sure.
do
For
next.
sure.
All right.
We are
Bye,
eager
everybody.
for that. Bye, bye, people.
Bye-bye.
See you.
See you.